2020 has been a year like no other. It's presented us with a season of uncertainty in job security, whether supermarkets' shelves are stocked with the everyday items you need, whether you will see loved ones for the next family event you're planning, or even if you're able to attend church next Sunday. In many ways, 2020 has helped us become more resilient, more adaptable, more creative, and more open to sharing our struggles and successes. When COVID hit Australia and we found ourselves in lockdown, it quickly became apparent that restrictions were going to be around for some time. For us at St Bart's, what we were on about, ministering to children and their families, was not going to change. But we would need to pivot exactly how we were going to do this. Before March 2020, 95% of what we did in St Bart's Kids was face-to-face. We wanted to maintain as much of these ministries as possible, but because we were unable to do face-to-face ministries for some time, there was a need to very quickly adapt to our new circumstances and find new ways of doing these ministries. Basically, with a bit of creativity, bunch of technology, and a lot of energy, we were able to continue doing over half our regular weekly ministries, even during lockdown. For us, and definitely there were some non-negotiables that we wanted to continue, such as writing our own Sunday Kids curriculum, delivering kids talks, engaging team, and maintaining personal contact with our families. What helped us give us clarity was in asking ourselves the key questions of what will we need to adapt? Is this a chance to reshape and try something new? And what needs to be held on pause at the moment? This has been a great lens to evaluate the things we do in ministry at every chance throughout this pandemic. Well, at the moment you might be in one of two situations, either off-site with face-to-face ministries on hold, or on-site resuming some of your regular ministries as possible and what is allowable at the moment. Well, both are very different in how you're planning and delivering, but both require time and energy to do them well. Well, in order to overcome the challenge of trying to minister to children and their families within a restricted face-to-face context, careful and intentional planning is paramount. If your aim is to make and mature disciples, and you want families to continue to be engaged during this time, there are three key things that you should focus on. That is communicate, to resource, and to care. For us at St Bart's Kids, we continued to focus on these three areas every time a change was thrown our way. And in doing this well, we've had the result of almost 90% of families re-engage in face-to-face ministries since restrictions have been lifted in our region. So how did we do this? Well, communicating our response plan to families and what we focus on each week was the first. It allowed them access to resources and enabled them to disciple their own family unit. It also gave them the confidence when we returned to on-site ministries that they could come along. We did this through regular social media, Facebook posts, emails, including our weekly e-news, or specific emails like our mainly music or kids club groups. We produced videos that help explain weekly content and the main teaching points, and even showcased some activities that we wanted families to try and attempt at home. We had to be extremely intentional about the type of media, the length, and the purpose in order to not overburden and increase screen time for kids and families when schools were also using this as their main communication channel during lockdown. The second area we focused on was resourcing. What we already knew before COVID was that parents are the primary disciple makers in their child's faith journey. Well, this was highlighted even more this year. By giving parents access to weekly resources that we produced, it enabled parents to feel less daunted by how to read the Bible and study it together, and also enabled children to continue with regular patterns of worship at home, discussion, Bible readings, and things that they would normally do with us on site here. We did this by giving weekly activity packs that were uploaded to our website that had early childhood activities, games, colouring, multimedia links, and descriptions of all the activities we were planning for that week. We had scripture passages that were modified for early childhood levels, lower and middle. We released a new ebook for bedtime reading in video format and provided links to videos that we used regularly in our worship time here. The final area we were intentional about was caring for each of our families. This showed our families that we were still here. Despite no face-to-face ministries happening, that we were still open and not closed. It was also a genuine opportunity to share the love of Jesus with them. And a few ways we made this happen, one of them was care packs. These were packs we put together and hand-delivered to each family, including letters for each of our Mainly Music Kids Club and St Bart's Kids children. It had stickers, lollies, colouring in sheets and more. There were Gospel and Mark deck of cards that we produced that we gave each family with a memory verse holder, Bible reading bookmark plans that families could follow on. As well as this, we had individual phone calls going out to each of our families to enable regular check-ins. And we had Mums and Bubs Facebook Messenger chats. COVID has also given us the opportunity to reflect on the way that we do our current ministries and how could we better maximise by modifying our current practices. One of the things that came out of our reflections was the decision to leverage access to video production and Zoom for some areas. It also gave us a spontaneous opportunity to improve our physical space. So when no one was on site, with a bit of paint and creativity and willing helpers, we created a fresh and exciting space ready for our ministries to resume face-to-face contact. There were countless other opportunities to make smaller changes that we'd previously not considered. For example, in Mainly Music, we are now using one space instead of 6 in the morning. This allows us to use the same space for morning tea, stories, chat, play, and it works. There's less cleaning, less transitions, more connections, greater community, and a less tired team. So whatever your current situation, it's obvious that 2020 has thrown us a curveball, given us much to reflect on, to look for opportunities to grow as leaders. And my prayer for you today is that God would continue to strengthen you as you work in this amazing area of ministry. That He would give you great wisdom as you tackle the big questions of what to adapt, what to change or pause. And that He would surround you with many people to encourage you and support you through the challenges that you might face along the way. God bless.
Hi everyone, Ed Springer from Anglican Youthworks here. Today I'm going to explore how the pandemic has driven youth ministry towards effective ministry practice. We all know young people have been hit hard by COVID. They've experienced social isolation like never before. They've explored how learning at home has worked. There's been sudden changes in family life, and for some of them that has been very unsafe. And every plan and every activity from schoolies to preschool has been thrown up in the air. Young people have experienced significant mental health concerns resulting from COVID. In Australia, every 60 seconds a young person reaches out to the Kids Helpline, and 50% of those calls are serious. It's been a challenging time for youth ministry and youth ministers too. No youth leader will ever share the joys of leading Year 7 boys online as they constantly change their screen names and turn off their cameras. Well, back in June, we surveyed 253 youth and children's ministers from across Australia to hear how ministry with young people had gone through COVID. Now, of the 126 working with youth, 31% expressed that they'd not been sleeping well. 53% have experienced higher levels of stress and anxiety than normal, and 80% have worked longer hours than expected in their roles. On the screen is a whole bunch of words, with the big ones showing the main words that people were expressing during COVID. So has youth ministry been on life support during COVID? Well, the overall picture has not been great. 60% reported that they'd had one or less newcomers visit their ministries from March to July. 51% indicated that they'd retained 80% or more of their normal youth during COVID. And only 50% had observed any spiritual growth in their young people. Digging deeper into the data offered some fascinating insights. Where youth ministry has struggled, this hasn't correlated with the size of the ministry. Some small ministries have gone great, some large ministries have not gone great. Where youth ministry has just provided online content, the ministry has increasingly struggled throughout COVID, no matter how slick the online presentation was. Now, this was a specific issue for youth ministry, because as you can see on the screen, the difference of what youth ministry and children's ministry did through COVID is really interesting. With youth ministry, we mainly focused on Zoom, centralised, controlled environments where we control the content, where in children's ministry, they balanced it. They used a variety of resources, online content, Zoom, and empowered parents and lots of people in relationships. So how has the pandemic actually driven youth ministry towards effective ministry practice? Well, in the 50% of youth ministries where significant spiritual growth has been observed through COVID, 3 human strategies were evident in all these ministries. Well, number 1, young people were more active and involved in the youth ministry during COVID. Where ministries engaged and got young people doing stuff, giving them the tools and communities to grow their faith outside the Zoom or the stream, this has led to growth. On the screen, there's 3 quotes from different youth pastors sharing how they did this. The first one, we have made small life groups out of large life groups, led by young people, and that will stay that way. Number 2, parents were more active in the discipleship of their teenagers. Groups who saw spiritual growth were groups who were confident to engage with parents, asking them to be involved in the discipleship of their own kids. They resourced parents with materials to do this and received positive feedback from parents about this ministry. Interestingly, children's ministers have connected with families 17% more than youth ministers. But I love this one. 50% of volunteer youth leaders have appropriately contacted young people and their families outside the ministry program for the first time. Where parents are engaged with their youth in Bible prayer and discussion, spiritual growth is happening. One church says we're going to continue with pastoral visits to parents of families with youth when they're connected to our programs, for this leads to growth. Number 3, volunteer leaders were more engaged in the program and engaging with families during COVID. Groups who saw spiritual growth were also the groups who equipped and delegated well to their volunteer leaders, whether it was a team of 1 or 50. This included pivoting from program-centric activities to a focus on relationships and personal discipleship. In those churches where they saw spiritual growth, 70% delegated important tasks to ministry leaders, 80% equipped volunteer leaders for ministry to youth. I love this quote. We have assigned leaders a few youth each to keep in touch with weekly by calling them to ask 3 general questions. How are you? How has COVID impacted you? And is there anything we can do or pray for you? It's been a hard season. And there is no magic bullet for youth ministry. We're called to prayer, being agile, creative, and especially patient across the months ahead. A youth pastor shared with me the other day as he reflected on the last 6 months, James 1:2, and he said, "Consider it great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing." He testified that God has grown him in great endurance over this last 6 months as he sought to serve the Lord. We need to commit to be praying for young people, their families and our leaders as we do this season. The good news is also that God has been active, growing his church and growing us as his leaders in the last 6 months. For when a pandemic shuts all our programs down, all of our camps down, what are we humanly left with? We're left with our Bibles and our theological principles. And the amazing thing is COVID has pushed many of us back to the why of our ministries. Rather than rolling out the same program in 2020, we've had to stop, pray and think, and ask, why do I do this ministry? And we've seen that word, prayer, and especially relationships with youth and parents and leaders are the keys to effective ministry. For many youth ministers, COVID has led to an increase in clarity in their theological principles for youth ministry. As I reflect on the last 6 months, I'm reminded of Paul's words to the Thessalonians. We cared so much for you that we were pleased to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our lives, because you have become so dear to us. Youth ministry is all about people, building God-centered relationships with young people and their families. COVID has driven youth ministry towards effective ministry practice as we've focused our gospel efforts on building God's people up.
Hi everyone, my name's Erica Hamence. I'm a Senior Assistant Minister at St Barnabas Anglican Church, Broadway in Sydney, and part of my role there involves overseeing the young adults ministry. So that's what I'm sharing with you about today. I've got 3 things to offer us today. The first is a thing that we've noticed that we think we can celebrate and what to learn from that. A second thing is a challenge and how to manage it. And then the third thing is an opportunity that I think we can leverage. So to kick us off, one thing that I think we can celebrate, at least in our context, this is one thing that we're celebrating, is that we feel like we've observed people coming with greater attitudes of gratitude. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, that was an accident. I think young adults tend to be tarred with this brush that they're entitled, and I don't think that they're any more entitled than most other generations are, but we definitely live in a context that has high expectations for lots of things, including church. And what I think COVID has done for us is it's erased all of those expectations. The status quo has changed. When we went into lockdown, the status quo changed radically. We could have had nothing, and instead to be able to have online church has felt like a real gift to people. People have been really grateful for it. It was thrilling to see someone on Zoom, thrilling to see their faces and to be encouraged by even their online presence. And then to have been able to go back to church, we've been able to be back at church for the past 2 months. Not all of us are able to. Lots of our guys are watching from online still. But even to be in the same space with one another, with shorter services, not being able to sing, all sorts of changes, it still feels like an improvement from what it could have been. And so when I think about that and I think about what we can learn from that, I think what it's exposing for us is that it's given us an experiential ecclesiology. And what I mean by that is we've never had a control group for our experience and our thinking about church before. We've never removed everything, started from zero, and been able to evaluate at each stage what the value of each element of church is. What is the value of singing? What is the value of being in the room together? What is the value of sitting next to someone or near them? We've never been able to experience all of those things in a quantifiable way before because they've just come to us in a package. But this year has given us an experience of each of those things. We've been able to miss those things, know what we've missed as a result, and therefore appreciate them when we have them back. That's been really encouraging for us to observe because I think it's helped us to reflect on God's providence in designing or orienting us towards these sorts of things. But I think we also want to express a little bit of caution about how long this gratitude will last. I don't want to be pessimistic about it, but I think that it's possible that those attitudes might shift again quite rapidly. And I think that's because whether you feel entitled or grateful comes down to an equation of ideas and investment versus influence. And what I mean by that is, does the power of your idea and the strength of your investment in the thing that you want to see changed or happen, does that match with the level of influence that you have over it? I think what's happened during COVID is that everyone has recognised that none of us have the influence that we want to over our circumstances. And so we've been prepared to accept something different from the ideas that we had, and something that doesn't quite match with our investment. But over time, that's going to change. We're going to have more of an expectation of the sort of influence that we're going to have over our circumstances. And I think that's going to mean that entitlement might creep back in. And so my question for all of us and for our ministry is, how do we encourage people to maintain a sense of gratitude that everything that we have is a gift, that none of these things can and should be expected, and that we can and should thank God for his generosity to us in giving us the very fact of church, not just an excellent experience of it or a comfortable experience of it. So that's our first thing, something to celebrate, but also something to be cautious of in that celebration. The second thing I think is a challenge, and a challenge to manage. You might be listening to me talking about going back to church, being in the building, people being grateful, all of those things, and thinking, well, lucky for you, that's not been my experience. We're still in lockdown, or people have not been that gracious with us. And I guess that's the thing. On one hand, we've never been so powerfully connected by a shared experience, and particularly a shared experience of difficulty before. But on the other hand, we all know that each of us is experiencing something different within that. So many people have said, we're all in the same sea, but we're not in the same boat. And that's true. And I think one way that you can think about what all of us have experienced, but our young adults in particular have experienced, is ambiguous loss. This sense of loss that can't necessarily be quantified, that doesn't have neat categories for it. I'm not a psychologist, and that is a psychological term. But here's what I mean for it in terms of our ministry context. In our context, lots of our young adults have had to work out what they do with weddings that they'd had planned. We had one couple who got married at the very beginning of lockdown so that they were able to be together. We've had others who've had to postpone them, or have the weddings that they didn't want to have without friends or family able to be there in person. We've had people who have graduated from university online with a very lacklustre ceremony, not much of an opportunity to celebrate that significant moment. And a huge number of our young adults who had moved to the city, maybe only had 2 to 3 weeks in Sydney, and then had to move back home. And that might have been overseas, that might have been Perth, that might have been regional New South Wales. Their experience of what are normally big years of celebration and fullness and fun have not been that. And so none of these things fit our usually categories for grief and loss. It's not death. It's not anything else that we would recognise in a normal category of loss. And we're all on a different timeline for how we're experiencing the sadness of those losses. Some of us have been able to go back to church, as we've said. Some of us have not. And what that means, I think, is that what we've had revealed for us, perhaps more clearly than ever we've had before, is that we in the church lack a theology of lack. We lack a theology of loss. We don't know what to do with loss. And I think you see that in the way that we try and counsel people pastorally over things. We tend to look for silver linings. We tend to point people to the good that you might presume that God is doing in a situation. Neither of those things are necessarily bad things to do, but they don't acknowledge the fact that for many of us, there's just a broad category of unanswered questions, unfilled losses. And I think we have a real opportunity within this challenge to minister to our young adults by offering them a theology of loss. They'll need it for the rest of their lives. It will sustain them in their faith if they know what to do with disappointments and frustrations, and if we are able to equip them with that. And so I think that's the opportunity that we have, but we're going to have to upskill on that if we're going to do that well. For us, what that's going to look like is next term we're teaching on Colossians, and I'm really excited about that because Colossians has such themes of fullness and contrasting with emptiness, of fulfillment and of shadow. These are all big themes in Colossians, and I'm planning on using that series to help our young adults to identify that loss is a predictable aspect of life, that it is to be grieved, and that God can be with us and offer us good in that grief. But as we're reminded in 1 Peter, do not be surprised at these painful times that you're in. That's not encouraging us to not find painful things painful, but to not be surprised by them. That's a worldview question. What kind of world do we live in? What COVID has revealed for us is that we live in a world in which loss and lack are normal, ordinary parts of it. And we need to know how to manage that as people of faith. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be doing. I wonder what your church is going to be doing in regards to that. The final thing is an opportunity to leverage, and what we've observed in our context is real energy for community. There's not much energy for anything else, but because people have not been able to be with each other for so long, there's real enthusiasm about getting together in groups. So what we did while we were in lockdown is train people in how they form communities of both mission and intergenerational relationships. That was not perfect at all. It was not my ideal way of doing anything. But what we've seen since we've been able to come out of lockdown is that we've formed at least 8 new community groups based on things like squash, swimming, dance, craft, bouldering, some suburb-based groups. And there's real excitement about getting those going. Most of them have started in some ways. They're drawing in new people, they're drawing in people who aren't Christians, and we want to keep leveraging that and make sure that that's something that we are able to sustain in the long term, and use for intergenerational relationship and for mission. We think that probably means giving people low-cost ways of getting involved. Everyone is a bit tired. Our resources are lower than they would normally be. And so we've had to create support structures, buddy systems for leadership that mean that the ministry itself doesn't fall down even when the person leading it does. We can talk more about that in our discussion time. But those are the 3 things that I wanted to share with you from our context. I'd love to hear about what young adults ministry is looking like in yours, and I look forward to our discussion time to do that. Okay, thanks, bye.